When I came home after being away for a few days, I saw my niece huddled in the corner of a closed room. In the midst of this oppressive, humid heat, she has been here without air conditioning? Since when? I rushed to my niece in astonishment. Clearly suffering from heat stroke, she was barely conscious. When I quickly contacted my sister, "I'm on vacation overseas with my husband," I got a ridiculous answer. I called an ambulance and dialed another number, one that had to be made. I couldn't forgive my sister anymore, given her history. She had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. I'm in my 30s and still single, and I work as a high school teacher. I live with my mother in our family home, since my father had already passed away. I have an older sister, but our relationship had never been particularly good from a young age. My sister has always been fond of flashy things, and has had a casual relationship with a lot of men. Juggling multiple relationships at the same time was second nature to her, and she constantly had boyfriends. Despite their self-awareness of being used, the men around her made no attempt to stop being her entourage. I couldn't fathom what kind of charm my sister possessed, but it was irresistible to those men. I, on the other hand, had a more introverted nature. I am the type of person who values a few friends and keeps them for a long time, rather than going out with many friends. I prefer spending my time reading books or visiting art museums. My sister viewed me as plain and unfashionable, and she didn't want people to know that I was her sister. If something didn't please her, she insulted my appearance and belittled my hobbies. Since I wasn't knowledgeable about men, she labeled me as unattractive and once tried to have a few of her male companions harass me. My sister was eccentric, but there were some decent individuals among her entourage, and thanks to one of them, I escaped without harm. Perhaps because I spent my school years in such a way, I unconsciously developed a resistance to the opposite sex. I don't need a romantic partner, and I don't need to be married to live my life. The key is to avoid dealing with my sister as much as possible. As my sister started working, she mellowed a bit, and she got married just before she turned 30. Several years later, she became pregnant and gave birth to a daughter. That little girl, my niece, will turn 5 years old this year. My sister boasts that she sharpened her judgment of men when she used to play with men. Since I didn't have experience with men when I was younger, she calls me an unattractive plain Jane. She says that my uterus must be wrinkled and useless. Recently, the teasing extended beyond appearances and often revolved around my lack of male experience. My self-assured sister, who believed that her extensive experience with men made her the ultimate woman, rarely took care of her child. Whenever something came up, she'd rush to our house and leave my niece with me, and then we would lose contact for a while. When my niece comes to our family home, she often appears thinner and smaller than kids her age. She claimed that she had fallen, but she often had minor injuries. And my mother and I began to question my sister's approach to child-rearing. One day, while I was away at work, my sister apparently brought my niece to our house again. As they debated whether she should go out, leaving her daughter there or not, our mother suddenly collapsed in front of my sister, and she called me and told me that our mother had been taken to the hospital by an ambulance. I explained the situation to a fellow teacher, had them take over my responsibilities, and I hurried to the hospital. The doctor who treated her told us it was a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and that she needed to be hospitalized. My sister regarded our mother's hospitalization as a hassle, leaving all the preparations, care, and payments to me before returning home. After that, our mother passed away, despite the treatment, while my sister never came to visit once. As I struggled to come to terms with it, the conversations about the funeral and related matters continued to flood in. She was my only sister, and I wished that she would cooperate, at least in times like these. However, my sister flatly refused to help with anything. While I was in deep sorrow, I took on the role of the chief mourner, managing the funeral arrangements, addressing the attendees, and constantly being on the move. The relief was that my longtime friends and the teachers from the school where I worked helped me. Once the funeral and cremation were over, there was a moment of respite. But I couldn't summon the strength to sort through our mother's belongings. Despite this, my sister left her daughter at our house, without hesitation, saying, "Take care of my daughter." She casually took some of the money from a bag containing condolence money that hadn't been sorted yet. I protested, "That's not something you can't just take it without asking. Give it back." Her response was, "Huh? There were a lot of expenses for the wake and funeral. What's the big deal if I take a little?" My sister insisted to take the money, saying that she had to spend money for the entire set of funeral attire, so I told her that I would give her money for that, and convinced her to return the condolence money. She seemed quite disgruntled, but eventually relented when I handed her a little more money than she'd expected. My niece was very attached to both our mother and me. Since my niece witnessed it when our mother collapsed, I couldn't help but worry that being left in this house might be traumatic for her. I felt anger towards my insensitive sister, but I wasn't sure how my niece would feel if I asked my sister forcibly to take her back to her house. It had only been a few days since the funeral, yet my niece, at the age of 5, appeared even thinner. On that day, I just couldn't muster the energy to cook, so I decided to order something my niece liked and get it delivered. Although she would usually be excited to choose, today she seemed quite reluctant. "What's wrong? You can order anything," I said, trying to comfort my niece. "Sorry," she replied. I had nothing that I want her to apologize for, so I asked, "What are you sorry for?" She replied hesitantly, "It's about Grandma." I interpreted that our family home was indeed a place of trauma for her after all. However, she insisted it wasn't like that. As she spoke with uncertainty, I would soon learn the shocking truth. On the day our mother collapsed, my sister and niece were there. Our mother had an intense headache and asked my sister to call an ambulance. My sister, however, dismissively said, "An ambulance for just a headache? It's embarrassing. Bear with it." Since it was a densely populated residential area, it was common for bystanders to gather when they heard an ambulance siren nearby. I also thought it was invasive for people to show interest in an emergency situation, but my sister should have understood the priority between that and a person's life. I had heard that subarachnoid hemorrhage was accompanied by intense pain, akin to being hit in the head with a blunt object. If it was just a regular headache, my mother wouldn't have asked for help. My niece continued, "So, Grandma looked like she was in a lot of pain, and I got her phone from her room and gave it to her." My mother, in a state of blurred consciousness, apparently managed to call an ambulance herself. However, her consciousness faded in the midst of it, and my niece desperately kept calling her grandma. "The person on the other end of the phone told me not to worry and that they were on their way to help," but my niece said. When she arrived at the hospital, there was still hope for her recovery, but the odds significantly changed in a matter of a few minutes. If my sister had responded instantly when my mother had asked her for help, the odds are quite high, and she might not have lost her life, even though she might have had after effects. All I was left with was regret because I wasn't there and because of my sister's neglectful attitude. Nevertheless, no matter how much I regret it, my mother wouldn't return. From now on, I decided to live with the enjoyable memories I made with my mother. I resolved to limit my interaction with my sister to the bare minimum. Afterward, the inheritance was divided, and I inherited the family home and land while my sister received savings, stocks, and other assets. However, the following week, my sister and her husband suddenly showed up at my house and started living there without my consent. My sister said, "Mark is not working right now since he quit his job, so we'll just stay here." And they acted as if they were guests, not lifting a finger to help with anything. They pushed all the household chores onto me, and even demanded meals. When I was at work, they would order delivery without my permission. I harbored intense anger close to murderous intent towards my sister and her husband, but if I complained, it would only hurt my niece. No child would want to see or hear someone speaking ill of their own parents. My niece, who is attached to me, was the only solace, and I wouldn't do anything to make her sad. I used that resolve to endure my sister and her husband's selfishness. A few months later, summer was in full swing, with temperatures rising every day. It was during this time when a friend invited me to go on a trip for a change of pace. My friend who came to the memorial service we held a few weeks ago noticed my exhaustion and arranged a trip for me, showing concern for my well-being. Grateful for the thought, I accepted the invitation and left my home for a few days. The last day of the trip was so hot and humid that it was unbearable, unless we were in a room with air conditioning. When I came home, drenched in sweat, I found my home filled with stifling heat. I wondered if anyone was home and, as I turned on the air conditioner, I realized that my niece was sitting alone in a corner of the room with windows closed. Wait, no way, she's been in this room the whole time? Since when? I was taken aback, threw my bags, and rushed over to my niece. Since she was sweating so much, and her whole body was so hot, I suspected heat stroke. I immediately tried to cool her down and offer fluids, but she was unable to drink on her own. When she didn't respond to her name, I called an ambulance right away. At the hospital, the necessary treatment saved her, and the medical staff explained that if I had returned home just a few minutes later, the outcome could have been the worst. My sister left her child alone, in a room with windows closed, and she even turned off the air conditioning. What on earth was she thinking? Besides, the remote control for the air conditioner was placed in a height place where my 5-year-old niece couldn't reach. I was so furious with my sister for putting my niece in this situation and going out that I thought I was going to lose my mind. When I contacted my sister, she told me that she and her husband were currently on an overseas trip. They were extravagantly spending the inheritance left by our mother. She actually snapped back at me and told me not to contact her with something that would spoil her mood. Don't ever contact me again for little things like this. Seriously, you are so dense, aren't you? Children are such a nuisance, why did I even have one? But since I already did, there's nothing I can do about it, right? I'm taking care of her, so that at least she doesn't die, but she blamed me saying that I killed our mother. Listening to my niece's account, I could understand her blaming my sister for her poor judgment. She's such a cheeky child. That's why I wanted to push her onto you, and I left her with you. She is still alive, right? You're the one who helped her, right? You should take responsibility and take care of her properly. That was the last time I heard from my sister. A few days later, when my niece regained consciousness, she said while crying, I wanted to take Grandma to the hospital as soon as possible. Why is it wrong to say that? My niece had been carrying that burden all along. She had thought hard, but she still couldn't resolve it, so she had asked my sister, who didn't do anything even though she was right in front of our mother. However, my sister felt that she was being blamed, so she abandoned her own daughter. She did something that could have cost her own daughter's life if something went wrong without hesitation. I should take responsibility because I had saved her? A decent human being would help someone in need, especially if they were a family member. I was certain that once my sister and her husband returned from their overseas trip, they would act as if it were normal to reside with us again. I couldn't take it any longer. I can't be in the same space with my sister and her husband. In my anger, I took action. I decided to sell the house and land as a package. Thanks to its good location, and the fact that, considering its age, it wasn't visibly deteriorating, I found a buyer for the house and land almost immediately. I moved to a condominium with my niece. When my sister and her husband returned from their month-long overseas trip, the house had been sold, and the locks had been changed so they couldn't go inside. Of course, they were furious. In retaliation, my sister reported to the police, claiming that her daughter was gone. I was the one who took away her daughter, and it was a case of kidnapping. However, do you know where your sister is? My sister, who didn't know where I was, couldn't answer the question. Finding my sister, who disappeared, is also your job as a police. You tax thief! She made a ruckus at the police station. In the middle of this, another detective asked to speak to my sister and her husband, on suspicion of abandonment by a person responsible for protection, and they froze. My sister and her husband were taken into separate rooms for questioning regarding their apparent neglect of their daughter. My sister tried to evade responsibility, claiming that she had severe postpartum depression and didn't intentionally abandon her child. She also began to shift the blame onto our late mother and me, saying that our mother on whom she relied had passed away and she was at a loss, and that I was uncooperative due to work when she sought help. Actually, since the time our mother was still alive, I had been consulting with the Child Welfare Office about the abandonment of my niece by my sister and her husband. Although it was said to be a very serious act, as long as my sister and her husband left my niece with my mother and me, when things got out of hand, there was still hope, so I managed to cooperate with the Child Welfare Office, without them finding out about it. My niece herself testified, "My mom often doesn't feed me, but she and my dad always eat delicious food. When I go to grandma's house, I can eat a lot and I get cleaned in the bath, so it's fun." My sister and her husband not only neglected to provide proper meals but also failed in terms of hygiene. They didn't send my niece to kindergarten or let her play outside. The only time my niece was able to live freely was when she was brought to our house. The Child Welfare Office said that the fact that they left her in a house with all the windows closed on a scorching hot day is a serious matter, and suggested that I report to the police. Before my sister could file a complaint against me, I had already made a first move. The police was informed that I had not taken my niece out without their permission, but that I was in a position to protect her. My sister and her husband could not get away with the crime, and would be in police custody for a while. Following that, they were harshly interrogated. They tried to garner sympathy from the jury and judges by emphasizing the hardships of parenting and the immense challenges they faced. However, they received no compassion, and their prison sentences were confirmed. Their inhumane acts became a hot topic in online news, and my sister's past relationships and promiscuity were exposed. Some of her previous partners even commented that she mistook herself for a very desirable woman, and she was pathetic. Others stated that she was a convenient woman because she'd sleep with them easily. Her husband was disappointed because he didn't know that she was that kind of woman. I officially adopted my niece, and we started living together. 6 months later, my sister and her husband were released from prison, but their criminal records made it challenging to find employment. Moreover, even in the new place they started living, the details of their crimes were known to those around them, and they were treated coldly. They experienced harassment, like stones being thrown into their property in the middle of the night. My brother-in-law finally decided to abandon my sister. When he asked my sister for divorce, she refused stubbornly. While my brother-in-law looked into her past relationships, it seemed that he found out the fact that she had once tried to make a man attack me. Since it was an unsuccessful attempt, I didn't file a complaint, but he threatened her that he would expose the fact that she planned to do such a thing on the internet. It seemed that my brother-in-law talked on and on plausibly, that this is the era when you can dig up anything from the past and make a case, and with that, he convinced my sister to sign on the divorce papers. From my perspective, they are both to blame. Subsequently, my brother-in-law returned to his family home and made efforts to lead a more normal life. However, the stigma of child abandonment followed him, making it difficult for him to secure a stable job. I'm not sure what happened to him afterward. My sister, abandoned by my brother-in-law, disappeared without a trace. 2 years later, my niece entered elementary school, and she had grown into a healthy and kind child. She regarded me as her mother, and, to those who don't know about our situation, we appeared like a true mother and child. Then, one day, we received a call from the police. They had found a woman collapsed on the street. She had no identification, but her fingerprints matched those on the list of former convicts, leading them to suspect she was my sister. Unfortunately, my sister had already passed away, and the forensic diagnosis was subarachnoid hemorrhage. In the morgue, my sister, who should have still been in her 40s, had completely white hair. She was emaciated, her skin lacked any vitality, and she looked dirty. It was presumed she had been living in a place made with cardboard boxes. She was unemployed, homeless, and had nowhere else to go. The cause of her death was the same as our mother's, and it felt like a form of retribution for the times she didn't try to help our mother. I hesitantly informed my niece of her mother's passing, not knowing how she would react. But she just responded with an indifferent "oh." Then she continued, "My real mom is the one right here. I hope you stay healthy and live a long time." I was embraced by my niece, and I vowed to protect and look after her for the rest of my life. Being with her has become the greatest source of happiness in my life.